Okay, so now that we've created our login page and we've converted over our app component to use the auth and unauth route components that we created earlier, the next thing we're going to do is see how to add Firebase Auth to our application by creating a special provider component, right? Basically, what we're going to do is just like we created a favorites provider and a friends provider earlier in our friend tracker application, right? And remember that these providers basically make the favorites state, right? Just an array of IDs of the user's favorites. And it makes the friends in the application, right, which are just a bunch of JSON objects. Just like these two provider components make those things available to everything inside of them, we're going to create a provider component for the Firebase Auth user state. So essentially, just like how earlier we created a use user hook that basically allowed components to easily access the current user state from Firebase Auth. Instead of doing that, we're going to basically create a user provider. Okay, and then inside here, we're going to have our components actually access that using context. So they'll be using the use context hook inside of there with a special user state context that we'll define. So that's our basic plan of attack. Let's see how to do that and actually make all of these routes work correctly without having to, basically stub out the logic as we've done. All right, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new context inside our contexts folder, right? Remember that this is where we created the favorites context and friends context, both of which were pretty simple to do. So we're going to say new file, and we're going to call this one user context.js. Okay, now what this context is going to do, it's going to be almost identical to these other contexts. So I'm just going to copy and paste, just going to copy and paste the friends context into here and rename it. So we'll say export const user context equals create context null. That should be user. Okay, and then we're going to create a provider for that context that will basically encapsulate all of the logic that's involved with logging in, with listening for changes, and so on and so forth. So inside the components folder now, we're going to create a new component for our user context, and we'll call that user provider.js. All right, so what this is going to look like is we're going to start off by saying import use state from React. Okay, we're going to be using that use state hook to basically keep track of our user and whether or not the user is loading. And we're also going to import our user context, which we defined from .. /contexts/user context. All right, and our component is going to look like this. It's going to be, we're going to say export const user provider equals, and inside here we'll say children. Right, this is going to be all of the components inside of our user provider's tags, just like we did with our other providers. And then we're going to say const is loading and set is loading equals use state true, and const user and set user equals use state, and that's going to be null initially. Okay, and for the JSX for this component, it's going to be pretty simple at first. What we're going to do is just say return. We're going to say user context.provider. The value for this provider is just going to pass through is loading and user, pretty similar to what we did with the custom hooks earlier. And inside here, we're just going to display all of this component's children. All right, now granted, this doesn't yet have any logic for loading the Firebase user or for logging in or anything, but that'll come later. What we're going to do first is we're going to open up our app component. Okay, I'll just open up app.js. We're going to import our user provider. And just while we're at it, let's delete this route import that we don't need anymore. Okay, so we'll go down here. We're going to say import user provider from components user provider. And then we're basically just going to add this user provider as a further wrapper around our favorites and friends providers. And we do want to have it on the outside because, as you'll see later on, our friends provider and our favorites provider are going to need access to the user, right? This will allow them to do things like load favorites using a user's ID token, which is something that we're going to need to add to our server's endpoints later on, is user validation, right? Making sure that the user who's requesting information, right, or the user who's trying to, add new friends is actually the user that data belongs to. Okay, so for that reason, we're going to basically put the user provider on the outside. And in fact, right, our navbar may well have need of the user provider as well, because we might want to do something like display the email of the currently logged in user, or change the buttons on the navbar depending on whether the user is logged in or not. So we're actually going to wrap this whole entire application inside our user provider. Okay, so I'm just going to have those two components there. We're going to take everything and copy and paste it inside those provider tags, and I'm just going to adjust the indentation there. And that should be all we need to do for now. So the next thing that we're going to do, now that we have this user provider component created, is we're going to add Firebase Auth to our application. Now, we walked through this earlier, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on how it works, but we are going to need to go into the Firebase console and create a new application and create a new project representing our React project here. So what you're going to want to do is open up the Firebase console, and you're going to want to click on this Add Project button here. And let's call this one Friend Tracker. And you may have noticed that I had another project called Friend Tracker Key already. That's just the one that I was using for development while I was creating these videos. So let's create a new project called Friend Tracker. You'll see the unique ID of our new project come up here. That's the ID that Firebase uses to uniquely identify our project, and it's something that we can't change later. So make sure that that's something that you like before creating your project. And we're going to click Continue. We're going to turn off Google Analytics because we don't need those yet. And this thing should spin saying, creating your project, please wait. Now, while that's going, let's actually install the Firebase package into our front end. And what we're going to do for that is we just need to say npm install Firebase and hit enter. And that should install the Firebase front end package for us. Okay, so let's go back here and we should see that our project is ready in the Firebase console. So let's click on continue. And the next thing we're going to do is add an app, right? Remember that basically once we've created a project, we need to also add an app, which just represents an individual platform that our project can be accessed on. So we're going to click on this web icon here. We're going to add an app, which we'll call React Frontend. We're going to leave this checkbox unchecked and click on Register App. And once that's done, we're going to see all of this code here. We just need to copy and paste that into the React entry point for our front end. So let's find index.js. And actually, instead of putting this code inside here, what I sometimes like to do is basically just create a utility function that will encapsulate all of that for us, right? That kind of helps keep Firebase logic outside the main portions of our code. So what I'm going to do here is inside auth, I'm going to say new file, and we're going to create a new file called setupfirebase.js. And this is what's going to contain all of that logic that we just copied. Oops, I need to go copy it again because I accidentally pressed Control-C. Okay, so there we go. I'm going to delete these comments because they're just kind of messy looking. And what we're going to do is create a new function here, which we'll be exporting, which we'll call setupfirebase. So let's just say const setupfirebase equals. We're going to put this thing inside of there, and we don't actually need const app, so we can just say initialize app. And we'll just export this setup Firebase thing as the default export by saying export default setup Firebase. And then all we have to do inside our index.js file now is say import setup Firebase from auth/setup Firebase. And then right before we call react-dom.render, we just need to say setup Firebase, and that will take care of basically linking our front end and the Firebase auth of our Firebase project. So let's head back to our Firebase console. We're going to click on Continue to Console because we don't need that code anymore. And let's go into authentication here and just create a new user that we can use for testing. So let's click on this Get Started button. This is all stuff that we did previously. And we're going to add an email and password authentication by clicking Enable. And we'll click Save. And then what we're going to do is go into Users, click on Add User. And for email, we're going to put sean@gmail.com, right? You can use whatever email you want. And for the password, we're just going to do something simple like that and click on Add User. Okay, and this is the user that we're going to use for testing. So you might want to leave this page open in your browser just because we'll need to do things like copy and paste this user ID here a little later on. So what we're going to do next is, now that we've set up Firebase inside our application, we're going to allow our user provider to listen for changes to our authenticated state. So to do that, you may remember this from earlier. What we're going to do is use the onAuth state changed function that Firebase Auth provides for us. All right, so what that's going to look like, we're first of all going to need the use effect hook here. And then we're going to create a subscription for the user's logged in state by saying use effect. And inside here is where we're going to use that onAuth state changed function that Firebase provides for us. So let's import that from Firebase Auth by saying import onAuth state changed from Firebase /auth. And we're also going to need to import a function called getAuth, which is just used to get a reference to the auth object on Firebase. So what we need to do next is inside useEffect, we're just going to say const auth equals getAuth, and then we're going to say return on auth state changed. We're going to pass auth as the first argument, and the second argument is going to be a callback function that basically takes the user or null as an argument to signify whether the user just logged in or whether they just logged out. So we're going to say user, and inside this callback, we're going to basically set is loading to false, and we're going to set the user object to whatever we got back from onAuth state changed. So let's say set user, and set is loading false. And that's pretty much all we need to do inside our useEffect hook. One other thing we are going to want to do is pass an empty array as the second argument to useEffect, because we only want this subscription to be created once, right? And we want it to be canceled when this user provider is unmounted, which honestly will probably only happen when the user closes our application, but it's just a good idea to have that there anyway. Okay, so now that we have this user provider thing created, we can actually modify our auth route and unauth routes to use this. So let's open those up. We're going to say, let's see, where are they here? Auth route and unauth route. And we're going to use the use context hook inside both of these to basically give our components access to the values that are being provided up in our user context.provider. So let's import the use context hook. We're going to say import use context from React. And we're also going to want to import our user context by saying import user context from contexts user context. And what we're going to do is, instead of saying is loading in user just hard coded there, we're going to say const is loading and user equals use context user context. Now notice here that the end result, right, the ending syntax that we're writing here is pretty similar to what we did before, right, where we said blah, blah, blah equals use user. Okay, and this kind of comes down to the beauty of React hooks, because essentially what we could do if we wanted to is create another use user hook that simply encapsulates this logic that we see here, right? It would just use that use context hook behind the scenes, and the end result would be the same. So the point here is that even though things are a little bit different behind the scenes because we're using user context instead of just creating a custom hook. The way that we end up accessing that is almost exactly the same thing, and we could make it the exact same thing if we wanted to. Okay, so let's do the same thing now with our unauthed route. We're going to open that up. We're going to import the use context hook by saying import use context from React, and we're going to import the user context as well. And then we're just going to do the same thing by saying const is loading and user equals use context, user context. All right, and that's really all we should have to do. Let's open up our application here. Oops, there it is. Oh, I guess first of all, we're going to need to allow ourselves to log in. So let's do that real quick. That's going to be pretty simple. We're just going to open up our login page. Here it is, login page. And we're going to add basic login functionality. And to do that, we're just going to put the login function directly inside our page. So we're just going to say import get auth and sign in with email and password, and we're importing those from Firebase Auth. Okay, so now all we need to do is add a login function here. We're just going to say const login equals, and inside here we're going to say const auth equals get auth, and we'll say await sign in with email and password, and we're going to pass the email and password values that the user has entered into there. And now we just need to make our login button call the login function by saying onClick equals login. And that should be all we need to do for now. So let's try logging in with this account that we created on our login page. What I'm going to do is just enter in sean@gmail.com. And the password here, ABC123. We're going to click login, and nothing happened. Oh, you know what it is? We need to actually run our front end, right? We killed it so that we could install the Firebase package. So let's say npm run start. Those are the kind of bugs that I like, by the way. And let's see, that'll open up our application. And oops, it looks like we're getting an error now. We just need to add an async keyword to our login function, which is something that, as I'm sure you've noticed by now, I always forget. Oh, and we also need to pass auth to this sign in with email and password. Okay, so let's try this again. We're going to refresh the page and we're going to try and log in with sean@gmail.com, ABC123, click login. And it does send us to the home page, but our home page now is, for some reason, having trouble loading its data. And that reason is very similar to the previous error we had. It's just that our backend isn't running. So let's get our backend up and running as well. I'm going to open up a new terminal inside the friend tracker server folder, right, which contains our backend. And inside here, we're just going to say npm run dev, which is the command that we set up to basically run our server. And we're just going to try refreshing this page now. And we should see all of our people are now displayed correctly. Although actually one thing that I'm noticing is that these images aren't being displayed, and the reason for that, it's something very small that I don't think I caught in some earlier video. We just need to open up our server.js file, and down here where it says populated friends, right, in this endpoint for loading all of our friends, we just need to remove this process.env.public URL thing from the front because we changed the profile picture URL on all of our friends to already include the public URL. So let's go back to here now. We should be able to refresh our page and see all of our people displayed correctly. So cool, we've set up our application with a login page now, and we've also basically allowed our application via a user context provider to know when the user is logged in and when the user is logged out, and basically respond to changes in that logged in state. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.